Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our workshop session in the huddle, pulling key people and strands together. And there are a few of us here, and we're going to be joined by some more speakers as well. And this is an informal session, which is going to give us an opportunity to reflect on what we've heard today, or to make points that we haven't had an opportunity to get across already in the conference. And the purpose of it is for all of you who are speakers in the workshop to think about what are the things that you would really want to see happen if we want to make real progress with place-based working. And you are the experts in the room, so I'm not going to say too much at all, but I'm going to come to all of you individually and ask you to introduce yourselves, and then just to give a few comments or reflections, or you can pose a question if you want to, and I'll go around everybody who's joining us, and then I'll bring it together in a discussion. And we're going to start off with Chris Donkin from London Sport. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Sally. So as mentioned, I'm from London Sport. I'm the new strategic lead for facilities and urban spaces, having joined London Sport in June, right in the middle of the pandemic. I guess the key takeaway that I've taken from today is something that Claire mentioned pretty much right at the start of the day, around barriers that people face when trying to access place, space, etc., and how there are lots of barriers. And I think you have to only look around London, and the things that Claire mentioned around Harold Hill up in northeast London they're evident everywhere in London. So how we start to overcome some of those barriers, and it kind of then touches into what Paula started to say around how we need to make kind of access to space and place accessible and convenient to people, and almost try and embed those places into everybody's daily lives, daily routines, to make it much easier for them to access. So I think in my role, that'll be something that I'll be straight away. I think we're already looking at how we do that and make it more convenient for people to access spaces, places for physical activity. But that's one thing that I'm going to definitely focus on going forward, and try to embed as much as we can into the projects that we'll be working on in the next couple of months.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. I mean, is there one thing that you think is blindingly obvious that isn't happening at the moment, or is it just much more complex and slower than that?
I think it's complex. I mean, I think that convenience part is something that we could probably play on in looking at some of the locations that we potentially use. There's lots of people that are inactives that will go to high streets, etc., and there's multiple opportunities there, especially with the pandemic and how that's hitting around, empty units that are going to become available, etc. So I think there is an opportunity to try and put activity in places right in the forefront of people's mind when they are doing their daily routines. So I think that's probably one of the obvious things that I would pick up on straight away.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody on the panel want to come straight back to Chris on any of those points, or would you rather wait until you have your say? Okay, we'll move on. Thanks, Chris, for opening up. So over to you, Katie. Would you like to introduce yourself and then give us your thoughts?
Yeah, my name's Katie Hall. I work for Enable Leisure and Culture in Wandsworth. I started just under 2 years ago now, kind of taken over the last year of the Get Out, Get Active project, funded by Spirit of 2012 and driven by Activity Alliance. So this morning I was part of the Getting an Inclusive Approach workshop, really reflecting on GOGA and how kind of place-based systems worked within GOGA, and what we did within the borough to really help people access activities, both inactive, disabled and non-disabled. And I think one of the key things that we've taken from Wandsworth, definitely, especially from our work with Activity Alliance, is these Talk to Me principles, which I think Activity Alliance have done a really good, it's very easy to follow. They're really good steps and really good principles that don't just apply across disability. I think it applies to everyone. Things like my values, reassure me, listen to me, include me are really, really key principles to be looking at when trying to include communities, not just disability, but all communities across London.
That's great. How easy have you found it to share the learning that you've come across? I mean, is it difficult to work with others outside your area, or is it an area where people are very collaborative naturally?
I think especially when you're looking at inclusive sport, everyone is, the goal's the same for everyone, so it's been really easy to kind of collaborate with people. And one of the key things that we've found with working within Wandsworth and not having a DPO specifically, then it's been working with outside people, like of sheltered housing associations, which we maybe would have not worked with before this project has been really key. And I think everyone has been really open and receptive to having sessions and activities and in different areas, places that they might not have had before.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And in terms of working with the local authority, how would you approach what you've done any differently if you had to do it all again?
Probably not. I think obviously I came in the last year, and I think from the first 2 years of feedback, there was a lot of kind of not failures, but failures, the sessions that it didn't really get started. And what we would have done differently if we'd done it all again was start right from the bat with these consultations with local authority, with local communities, with local community hubs and local organisations. I think that would be, if we were to do it again, we'd maybe start with more of that consultation period that didn't happen in the beginning. Would be our only change, but on a whole, I think it's been quite successful.
That's good, thank you. Adam, can I come to you next? And you obviously have you're in a great position where you see what's going on nationally. So what are your reflections on what you've heard today, or in general around this subject?
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's great to hear and see colleagues around London and indeed elsewhere in the country taking up the challenge in working in a different way and approaching things in a more asset-based way. I mean, yeah, I was interested in your one thing. I'm not sure there is one thing. There isn't sort of a single thing that can solve the shift of behaviour in terms of people becoming more active and at a population level. I think it's a number of things, and I think that's what I was reflecting on this morning in terms of the complexity of the lives that we lead, but the challenge, but the importance of really understanding what the lived experience is like. And I come back to the point I made earlier around that progress moves at the speed of trust, and having an asset-based approach which really commits to a deep community engagement, I think, is really important at the heart of this. And it may not be that the starting point is always how active are you, but actually it might be a different point of engagement, which is around connecting people locally on the terms that best meet with where they are at. And the challenge of getting active if you're inactive is quite daunting. So small steps and steps which, as I say, might start with a different type of conversation, but might lead eventually to becoming more active. I do think that the whole leadership piece is really important. Leaders at all levels, leaders within communities, leaders within the public sector, leaders politically are really important in creating the energy, the energy for change, which is about building that shared purpose together. And I also think the other aspect in here, which is exciting, is around collaborating with other parts, with other partners and stakeholders that may be beyond the traditions of, of sport, physical activity, sector, or environment, but they give reach to a wider community base where some of those other organisations have built real trust and a rapport with communities, and then often the strongest places to start some of the conversation and engagement. So yeah, there are sort of a few things which I think we're seeing and learning from the approach to local delivery pilots. I know Lola's on the call here as well, and Lola leads the Hackney pilot. So I'm sure she'll build on the richness of what's happening in the context of Hackney.
Thank you, Adam. And I was really struck with how important leadership is in all the sessions that I've heard in the conference so far. It's so key, and also it feels very optimistic as well. There are so many passionate and committed people leading, which is very positive. Do you have a sense of optimism about it? Because it must be such a strange time with COVID, but you do sound upbeat. What is your assessment of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, I said earlier, some of the what COVID has brought out is the strength of community up and down the country. That communities coming together to support one another, and the backdrop of the circumstances for physical activity are really difficult. With the lockdown measures and restrictions that there are, and I don't underestimate that. And we heard a bit about that earlier from Paula as well in Croydon. In the context of the leisure offering and environment around that. But in times of crisis, I do think it brings out the strength, as I say, the assets that we have in communities to pull through. It won't be without its challenges, and we'll have to do our best to maximise the resources that we each have at our disposal. But maybe that's an opportunity in and of itself to do things in a different, more joined up way to better meet the need that we're seeing.
Thank you. Claire, if I can come to you next, if you want to introduce yourself, then just give us your assessment on how it feels to you, because you're obviously coming from, you're not in the sports sector, but you have a great insight into London.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you, everybody. It's nice to see some of you again. I'm Claire Harding. I'm the Research Director at Centre for London. And to say something else I said earlier again, I have an energetic toddler downstairs who seems to keep shouting car, which is his current obsession. So sorry about that. The door is shut, but it's not always enough. Adam's just said a lot of what I was going to say about the impact of coronavirus. It does feel like an elephant in the room. I don't want to diminish at all the fact that this has been quite possibly the worst thing that has happened in my working life. I think that's probably true of almost everybody here in terms of our ability, particularly when I was still working in childcare and early education, which I wasn't until quite recently, to actually deliver the stuff to people who need it and to support communities in the way that we want to support them. But I do think that there are some good things that we've seen. Adam's referred to the sense of community, and I think the press would have it, but it's all fraying now when we're all yelling at each other because we had disagreements about the lockdown. I'm not actually convinced that that's true. To me, it feels like on the ground, there is still a great deal of concern for one's neighbours and a desire to help one another out. And I think we have also seen shifts in people's ideas about physical activity, whether that's sort of organised sport or getting a trampoline to the back garden if they're able to. Partly because not being able to have something really does make you want it, and I can certainly testify to that. I have never been more enthusiastic about getting up into the mountains than I was this summer. But also, I think because we know that there are links between health and physical activity, and I think people are seeing that a bit more. And in the data that we have at Centre for London, there's far more people interested in cycling, which I know is slightly out with this topic area, but is certainly connected to it. So that feels really important. Far more use of parks, in particular, and at risk of breaking my own data embargo, which I will try not to do in too much detail. Older people in particular making much more use of parks than they did before, and that's fantastic. And what can we do with that, particularly when we're talking about working in place, with that enthusiasm about our local assets and resources, our physical assets, our community assets, to make sure that as we very, very slowly and in a bumpy way climb our way out of this hole, we don't accidentally abandon the few good things that have come out of it.
Yeah, Sally, I do think, well, we have seen through our own data and what we've heard in communities, inequality has been exacerbated through this period, which is deeply concerning, and the underrepresented nature are in physical activity is profound. We've seen that in terms of a range of different audiences, and we shouldn't lose sight of those that haven't got access to green space or haven't got access to a garden. That many of us would take for granted, and that's become really difficult and challenging. Some communities needing to continue to self-isolate in this period, and that self-isolation leading to lower levels of physical activity and a real strain on people's mental well-being, mental health. We've sought to try and support partners around some of that through our approach around tackling inequalities funding and that. And there are other national charities and bodies and local authorities are trying to do similar. But we are seeing a negative impact of that landscape on people's behaviour, making, as I say, those inequalities more profound in this period.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking the same when Claire was speaking and mentioned that whole issue about access, because we do, I think, take it for granted. And my former role, which I've just finished, was as a police officer in London, and we were obviously trying our best to encourage people to abide with the coronavirus regulations. And in the early days, that was so hard because there were so many people that were living in flats and that just wanted to come out with their children for a kick around for 10 minutes to get them out of the flat. And they couldn't do it because of the lockdown. And as it's gone on, obviously the lockdown regulations have changed, but very difficult, that whole subject of access, even if people have the will to do it. A really important point to highlight. Lola, can I bring you in here, or would you like to introduce yourself and give us your reflections?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lola Akindoying, and I'm the head of programme for Kings Park Moving Together, which is Hackney's local delivery pilot. So my reflections would be, I think, very similar to some of what Adam has shared already, and particularly around the issues of inequality and just seeing kind of a greater lens on those things. But I do think that, it is important for us to be optimistic about the future and about the fact that this is a moment in time, and that, the focus on health and encouraging people to be in better health, and that physical activity is a part of that, is something that I think very few people find it hard to disagree with. And so I think even in the conversations we've been having about systems change, sometimes your colleagues and your kind of allies and people who can advocate for your work aren't at all connected to sport and physical activity. They sit beyond that, but actually they're really crucial in terms of helping you to create the right conditions that enable people to be physically active. So I think it is a difficult time, and certainly for our pilot, we have we're still on that kind of journey of what next, and we are concerned about our kind of distance to people at this time, really wanting to support people, but also wanting to have empathy and understanding for where people are in their lives at the moment, but absolutely seeing mental health and supporting people around kind of improving their mental health and using physical activity as a way to keep going as something that we really need to make sure that we're looking at.
It's a great last point, Lola, and that was mentioned in the first session this morning around, if it was a question actually, around empathy. And when we are talking about policy and funding and how do all the different providers and the different agencies involved really demonstrate that empathy, which is so important, isn't it? I think it's a really hard task. I don't know if you have any thoughts yourself on actually how do you do that in practice? You don't have to answer that, but it was a good question from earlier that struck me about, yes, of course we talk about trying to empathize with people that are really going through it, but how do we demonstrate that in what the outputs are?
Sure. I mean, I don't know that this is the answer. I can only share, kind of my reflection. I think it is about listening. I think it's important to recognise that people's lives are different from our own. And that, everybody has, is on their own journey with physical activity. I've, reflected often about my own experience, the experience of people I know, as well as people who kind of are absolutely sold on physical activity as being, sort of centre of their lives, really. But I think it's also just about being able to listen and revisit that and revisit those conversations. So something that, the situation 3 months ago may not be the situation now, and that people, as they live their day-to-day lives, are living in their own kind of complexity in a sense, and to not patronise within that, I think, is also really important. The kind of them and us, as opposed to the kind of we. And yes, our we is different, because we are all individuals. But I think there is something about also just kind of recognise, using your empathy to demonstrate that, you understand.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Paula in a moment. But first of all, can I ask anybody in the audience, if you want to pose any questions to the panel, please do enter them onto the chat. And I'm going to come to Paula and then to Lorna, and then we'll have an opportunity to ask some of those questions. If any of you have got something if you've just heard somebody say something and you want to ask a question on it or to challenge it, then please do so. So Paula from Croydon, could you introduce yourself and then either respond to any of the points that have just been made? You might want to talk about empathy and listening, or give us your reflections on this whole subject of place-based working.
Sure. Yes, I'm Paula Murray. I'm Director of Culture and Leisure at Croydon Council. I think the thing I want to respond to that's jumped out at me was Lola's point. The phrase she used was "is a moment in time," and I am desperately hanging on to that. I'm hoping this is just a moment in time, and I am finding it immensely difficult to see life beyond. But I'm just really hoping that we can all just kind of hang on and make it through this particular moment in time. I also want to hang on to Adam's optimism. Which is right, and everything he talks about is really grounded in the pilots and in real experience, and that the optimism, I think, is reflected in some of the work we've done in Croydon, the surveys we've done of people's usage of their local parks and spaces during this time. It's absolutely reflected, and I said this earlier today, the value that they place on it, and that's for physical activity, but the impact on their mental health as well. But one of the other questions we asked was about people's appetite for volunteering and getting involved. And actually the responses on those questions were really very, very positive. And I think that does mark an interesting, possibly surprising at this particular time, but an interesting shift and a very positive shift. So that's the bit of optimism I also want to hang on to. But I have to say that, local authorities are in a very, very difficult position, and our leisure operators are in a very, very difficult position. Lorna's here, and she may talk to some of this, but she's doing some cracking work across the sector in bringing together people who are sharing those issues and offering advice and training. It's very good, Lorna. The stuff that you're putting out is very good and very helpful. And I think that really we all need to come together in terms of the lobbying and the advocacy, because this is a moment in time where we could lose big chunks of our leisure sector forever, or certainly for a very long time. And so, slightly aside from the discussion about place and space, I think there's a very, very important point in time for us to come together in that messaging and that advocacy. And Lorna's work is exemplary in that area already. So mixed messages from me. Sorry, Sally, mixed messages. But I guess that's how we're all feeling at the moment.
Oh no, that's great, and great to have a shout out for Lorna as well, who's going to be the next to speak. But just before we come on to Lorna. So when you say, Paula, about we need to come together to lobby and advocate, and I understand what you're saying, but how can that happen? How, if you could project forward and look at, oh yes, we've successfully done it. Look, jump forward 6 months. And what could happen in the next 6 months to make a difference?
I think some funding from central government for the leisure sector would be really, really, I think it's as long and short as that. I think that the sector, alongside the cultural sector, are very particularly hit by COVID. They were hit earliest, and they're going to take longest to come out of it as well. And I think it's not huge sums of money in terms of government funding, but I think there needs to be a package of support for the leisure sector and for the cultural sector as well, and that message needs to come from all of the voices around the table here and beyond. And the way there, I think, is a mixed kind of campaign. It's not political, actually. It's completely floats above the politics. But that's what I think it is. I think the sector needs a bit of a lifeline so that we can get through. And I think it is 3 years. In my head, it's a 3-year period. But the potential losses, I think we're teetering on the edge of it. And I'm really worried about that.
Okay, thank you.
Whether it's extended furlough schemes or whatever, something that particularly suits the sector.
Okay, thank you. So Lorna, we'll come to you. If you could introduce yourself and
I kind of don't want to introduce myself. Paula's made it difficult for me to. I've got to sound articulate now. That's unfortunate. Thank you very much for those kind words. I think so. I'm the strategic relationship manager at London Sport, and I think there's a few things that people have talked about already that I think are really important, but they actually all come down to that empathetic side of things, which is putting that question first. And Katie, who's I think having connection problems and keeps dropping on off the call, but in her session earlier, she talked about putting the inclusive question at the beginning of everything they do. So it's the first thing that they think about, and they've made sure that they've given staff training and that they've supported all of their organisations to be able to put that question at the beginning. So I think when you asked that question earlier of how do we ensure that we can be empathetic, that we can engage and understand where people are coming from, we have to hold the space for who is it we're trying to work with, who is it we're trying to reach, and therefore, and what matters to them, and take our time to really understand that end of it. If it's not our own personal experiences and our own personal life, we've got to take that time at the beginning. And the more we do to understand that, the stronger position we're in to be able to move things forward and change the system and empower those people's voices to be properly heard. And it comes down to exactly the same thing that Paula's just been talking about when you think about the damage to facilities and the damage to provision at the moment that this particular incident, and I do see it as Lola does, as a moment in time. Those challenges are what we have to deal with right now. And we have to accept that if we don't deal with that challenge, we won't be looking at dealing with inactivity or as the problem we know it before COVID. What we're looking at is something massive, way beyond what we ever sort of feared would happen. So we have to address this sudden thing that has happened to be able to ensure that in the future we can actually continue to address the really big challenges that we've got right now. And that's, I think, why we've been so lucky to recruit someone like Chris at the time when he joined us, because his expertise and knowledge has become incredibly valuable immediately. So he's had a baptism of fire starting with London Sport, but he's been amazing at ensuring that we can support London through a particularly challenging thing when we're already a facility deficit area.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Lorna. That's really good, taking on the discussion. Would anybody like to respond to Lorna on any of those points before we move on to questions? Okay, so the first question that I wanted to ask you, and I don't mind who has a go at answering it, but it's a good one that's come from somebody in the audience. So how important is diversity in leadership in reacting to the needs of communities? And we touched on leadership, and we know that it's absolutely vital and key. But how important is the diversity of leadership? Who would like to answer that one from their own experience or from what they see around them?
Sally, I'm happy to start on that, if that's okay. Yeah, really important for me. And we talked earlier this morning about leadership at all levels, and I reinforced that earlier. I think what we've seen in pilots, the ability to build trust, is really fundamental and significant, and for people to be able to connect with people like me, which is a phrase that which is a project that we've been working on in Birmingham, around volunteering and coaching, which is about people being able to connect to, if I live within a community and I'm representative of that community and people know me and they trust in me, then it's easier to connect and to engage. So, and looking at the diversity of our communities, the diversity of our leadership should be consistent with that. So, yeah, I think it's really significant, really important.
Thank you. And I was struck yesterday by Sporting Equals, who are talking about the programs that they're doing to try and increase that diversity in leadership because of that deficit. Lorna, did you want to come in on that point as well?
Yeah, I was just going to, I can't tell if my mic's on or not. Are we okay?
Yes, yeah.
Great. Sorry, I'm having problems with the little green light. Yeah, one of the, I'm a big fan of sort of reading around topics and reading around sort of issues. And I read the data gender gap a little while back. And one of the things that came up in that was the importance of recognising that it's not enough to kind of have, obviously it's from a position of female against male gendered split, but it's not enough to just have a woman in the room. That actually the cultural shift and balance to things like that is that women struggle to feel like they're in a position to be able to speak unless they're actually within either a 50-50 split or a majority. And I think diversity is incredibly important, because actually that allows anyone who's felt in a minority outside of that room to have the confidence to speak, because they're no longer in a minority. So I think we have to be really clear that we have to lift up people and we have to give that opportunity for people to take leadership positions. They don't necessarily have to be formal leadership positions, but they have to be given the environment in which they can actually lead what is going on. And that's why some of the asset-based, place-based stuff is so important, because it empowers the community to take a lead in things that they probably never thought they could lead before. That's great. And that does sound a winning formula, the way that both you and Adam describe it about being community. If it's community-based and the people leading it are from the community, then they will reflect the community. And your point as well, Lorna, absolutely right. I know that from my own experience in an organisation which does not represent the community that it serves. Paula, did you have any reflections on that point in terms of leadership and diversity?
Yeah, I think the only other thing I would add to what people have already said is that in any leadership model, it's a very obvious point, and having that diversity does make for much better decision making. Having the different viewpoints, different cultural viewpoints, different backgrounds around the table, it's much better decision making, and it's much more comfortable and long lasting decision making as well. Better decision making. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other points on that leadership and diversity before we move on to the next question that's come in?
Yeah, I'd just like to add something. And I think it is about kind of being able to actively embrace diversity in its broadest sense. But I would agree with Lorna about the importance of also creating the right conditions where people can come with their authentic self, and that doesn't have to be in a way that works particularly for a particular set system or structure. And so we all have kind of ways of working or ways of doing things. And I think truly being able to make sure that we're embracing diversity, and having diversity in leadership is also about being willing to work differently. And that doesn't mean that it's any less than, it's just about a different approach. And by doing that, I think it does allow people to come as they are, and then you start to see that diversity represented in the work that we're doing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you. That's a great point. And on to the next question, which has come from the audience, which is, how can you join up with a shared purpose with organisations to get the best impact? So who has a view on that, about different organisations, different financial positions, different objectives, but shared purpose, and how best can you harness that? So does anybody have any great experience, or what not to do, or what you would like to do? Who would like to start off around shared purpose? Paula.
Well, I think we got into a bit of this morning, really, in that one doorway in is the place-based approach, and that's sort of a manageable doorway in. So people coming together around a manageable, recognisable, shared agenda, whether that's recognisable in terms of a place or a shared issue or shared community. So we did talk about that quite a lot this morning as one way of creating that shared agenda. I think, and this is very difficult in this current time, I think there's so much to be said for literally having people in the same room, and face-to-face contact and talking, and we also talked about listening this morning as well. But actively creating the shared agenda, actively exploring and forming the shared agenda, the common ground with people. And I believe that local authorities have got a really strong role to play in facilitating that, creating the conditions for that to happen. I do think it happens really better face-to-face. And I think it's one of the mainstays, isn't it, of the place-based approach, one of the main reasons to do it.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, can I ask you back, Paula, because local authorities themselves can be siloed, and they, in their own departments, they have different objectives. And I know that you're representing Croydon, and there are those two in London. But what's your view on that, around how much does that get in the way, the internal structures?
Yeah, well, it absolutely can do and does. And particularly at a time, which I think I said earlier on, at a time of real financial challenge. I can't remember if I did say this or not, but people do have a tendency to drop back into their boxes at that kind of time. And yes, it is an issue. We are hierarchical and sometimes siloed organisations. We absolutely are. And I think we are trying to challenge that internally. We're trying to work differently, and it's the same principle. It's working around a shared agenda. And again, the place-based approach does do that, create that for local authority, and we see it very actively in the examples I gave earlier: community development, regeneration, and particularly for Croydon, in the way that we run our antisocial behaviour services and domestic and sexual violence support services as well. Have a very good kind of joined up, cross-reaching approach. But I think it's an ongoing thing, and it's organisational cultures, and it will take time. I mean, I wonder, thinking out loud, what is the impact that COVID will have on all of that? Will it give us a big shove in the right direction? Or not? I mean, I would hope so.
Yes,
but it's going. It needs raising all of the time. It needs challenging all of the time.
Yes, yeah. I agree, and I think it certainly this whole situation emphasises the importance of tight partnership. Lorna, did you want to comment from the perspective of London Sport on that whole that question that I just asked about silo working and barriers?
Yeah, I think the relationship management team that I look after, they do a lot of work out in the local authorities, and a lot of that will be talking to councils and supporting them to engage. And I think one of the things we notice is that the local authorities who manage to work across departments, manage to have collaborative pieces of work going on and manage to pull on each other's resources effectively, are the ones where they take the time to go to each other's meetings and be aware of each other's events and approach a department from a perspective of this is what matters to you and this is how we can help you achieve that. And the ones that really struggle with it are the ones that almost can't seem to have those conversations with who is next to them. And in a few cases, that's where our relationship manager can really come in, and they've sort of sat down within council offices and been able to talk to different members of staff and go, what do you do? Oh, you do this, and introduce them to somebody else. I think there's a potential awkwardness from internal colleagues, and I used to work for a local authority in London, and you almost kind of don't want to go over to someone when you've seen them for months, years across the aisle from you, and just go, what do you do? Because we might be able to connect on something. I always used to like that we got restructured around the building, so we used to get moved to a new section and you could always introduce yourself to everyone around you. But I think that's one of the biggest challenges is councils are massive and there are lots of staff and lots of departments and lots of things they're committed to having to do, and sport and physical activity isn't something they have to do, so we've got to be able to sell it from its perspective of what it can do for the things that a council is trying to achieve and other departments are trying to achieve, and we've got to be brave enough to put ourselves into those meeting rooms and into those spaces and into those agendas, which is something I think the local delivery pilot, so I don't know whether Adam or Lola have got an opinion that they sort of want to bring to this, they've really had to do that to be able to drive some of that stuff forward.
Yeah, no, that's great. Chris or Lola or Adam, did any of you want to come in on this specific point, and then we'll move on to the next question?
Yeah, I can say something else. I think adding to what Lorna said, it's just around, I guess, capturing the different teams that become involved. Lola mentioned in her presentation earlier around identifying, I think she said, unusual suspects that you would have never thought about, and I guess it's helping to teach other local authorities that, who are these unusual suspects that they might need to go and target. And the more that we can capture who is involved in projects, who's contributed successfully to a project, the more we can tell other local authorities, other partners about, the right people to involve from an early point. I think the more we're going to get that effective relationships across councils, across, working with London Sport, etc., etc. So, the more we can capture, learn, share best practice with other local authorities, I think is going to be key going forward as well.
Yes, thank you. Lola or Adam?
Yeah, I just was going to come in, and I was actually going to ask Chris to maybe give his reflections on a meeting that he joined probably about a month ago or so ago. We were looking at kind of creating an active environment and the colleagues that were around the room. So, Chris, would it be okay for you to maybe share your reflections of that meeting? Yeah,
no, I think I wasn't sure what I was or what to expect from that meeting, but and from speaking to people before the meeting, it was, things had probably been slow to get going, and obviously COVID had not helped that. But when I attended the meeting, there was, within the first 10 minutes, it was clear that kind of people had been engaged and almost taken the mantle of really getting involved, and had actually come to the meeting with some fantastic ideas as how things could be done. I'm thinking the street scene team, especially Lola, I think it was, had visuals of what it would look like, and had almost taken that responsibility on to really drive something forward. So again, engaging them, it was really good to see that, they've done a lot and brought some really good things to the table that I think are then going to really drive progress going forward in the Hackney pilot. Yeah, absolutely. It was the street scene, strategic property, parks and green spaces, traffic, people that are managing traffic, the whole range of people that have a role to play in creating an environment. And actually sport and physical activity, that wasn't so much the starting point. It was like, where do our agendas have commonality, and then building from that. And that's how we have ended up with kind of such a group of engaged colleagues.
That's really good to hear, a real practical example of what you've been talking about.
Sally, can I just add a comment on that? Is that okay?
Yes, please do.
Because it really struck me, and just as Lola was describing that there, the importance. I'd scribbled down on my notes around going where the energy is and building some momentum. And actually, the amount of work that Lola and colleagues have done to get to that point shouldn't be underestimated in terms of the time to build the conversation and build the trust and build that shared sense of purpose. To get to that kind of space that was just being described is really important, and it's not something you can jump straight to or necessarily rush. It does take time, but it's like the good foundations of a building. You know, if you try and build up from poor foundations, then the building topples over quite quickly. You don't, So laying those foundations and getting that right is really, I would say, and our experience with the pilots is time really well spent.
Yes, that's a really good point. And so that example that Chris and Lola just gave, you can see how that works in practice. So thank you. We're coming on to our last question now. Another interesting one. There's a lot of research on inequality and so much need. So how do you decide where to prioritise? Who would like to have a go at answering that tricky question?
I'll try to be brave.
Thank you, Claire.
I think it's a difficult question. It's only going to get harder because need is only going to get greater. I think it's really important to take both a place-based and an intersectional approach here and recognise that it's not just about sort of ticking disadvantaged boxes. It's about thinking about the totality of people's lives in as far as we can from the data to work out who are the people who are going to be, I suppose, struggling the most in this moment is maybe the best way I can put it. I think there's a balance to be struck between trying to spend money, as always, on meeting immediate need now and on meeting need in the future. And with my families and young people's hat on, I always feel the need to put in a bid for small children as a group who are quite often maybe underheard because what they say isn't necessarily very coherent, or what my little boy says isn't always very coherent, but maybe a group that get particularly but it's particularly important to listen to, and we could extend that out into other groups who are, for all sorts of reasons, less able to get their voices heard by decision makers. It must never ever be a case of those who shout the loudest.
Okay, wise words. Mustn't be those who shout the loudest.
Wise words, but not very useful. Sorry.
No, but it's absolutely true, isn't it? And not just in this sector. I know that from my own experience. Any other views on that one? How do you decide how to prioritise?
I'll come in, Sally.
Yeah.
I think with the projects that we've been doing, and it's been mentioned earlier, the reliance on insight to actually try and identify where those needs are greatest. Now that, as people have said, there's needs everywhere, but if we can hone in on actually where there are the needs, and I think we've been trying to do this with the projects that we're doing around the COVID response, is actually identifying the places where we knew things like inactivity were already highest, and if we can get in there and really make a change, then we know we're hitting those people that need it most. But I think there is probably a little bit of a point to making sure that we've got a buy-in from the partners to engage, and we're almost pushing on open doors. We've seen a couple where we know there is a need there, but if we've not got partners on the ground that are willing to work or willing to move at the pace, it's quite hard to make that change. So I think it's key that we engage the partners that are willing to change and are probably up for the challenge as much as we are at London Sport, and vice versa. We're up for the challenge as much as the local authority partners or other partners on the ground are. Does that make sense? It
does make sense. Paula?
I think just to add to what Claire and Chris have already said, I think there is a huge amount of data and information out there, and local authorities, as I said earlier, have got access to that. And as have public health, we've got an incredible range of really useful data. So I think there is absolutely something in a data-driven approach. But, you know, local authorities are also subject to policy frameworks and political manifestos. You know, there are a number of other drivers for you know, making things happen. But it's Chris's last point I want to try and elaborate on a bit really as well. I feel that when things happen successfully, there is a sense, you get a sense of the stars aligning, of things all coming together and clicking, and, you know, to make a successful, whether it's a program or a project. And it's a combination of that, the partners properly buying in, as Chris describes, the, you know, the stats lining up, you know, this is something that needs to happen. Funding comes into place, and there is a sense of, yes, this is the right place and the right time for this to happen. And it's not completely scientific. I think it's also about people and energy and motivation and the right things coming together, and the leadership, political leadership, community leadership. But it's not purely scientific. So whilst I think the data is hugely important, it's not, as Chris has said, you know, it's not enough on its own. And I'm a really great believer in the moments where the stars align and looking for those moments.
Yes, I recognise that.
You need a dose of opportunism as well. To be quick on your feet and jump on that moment when you see it. You can have all the strategies in the world, but, you know, the right moment will come along to go, you know, yeah, oh, grab that. And that's true. It happens.
Yes, and things can happen very quickly, can't they? They don't have to go through months and months of governance. So yes, no, great point. Lorna, did you want to add something to that discussion?
Yeah, it's a slightly cynical sort of response, but actually feels really harsh to say cynical and then say this, but it goes back to something Adam said in the keynote this morning, which is one of the decisions about the things you can do is, where have I got the opportunity to learn a huge amount that will benefit others being able to do similar things, follow similar paths, or make wiser choices in the future? So we recognise that one model does not fit all, but we also recognise there are key components to things that do allow other places, other projects, other people to consider and make better and wiser choices in the future. So I think we use the insight, we understand where need is, we understand the audiences we're trying to work with, we look where the energy is, and where the energy is one of my favourite things to say when I'm kind of trying to make decisions on where to go with things. But we also look for that opportunity of what can we learn. And I think you see that when you look at the 12 local delivery pilot locations. There's some really obvious differences between some of them, and there's some really obvious similarities. And because of that, there's the ability to learn a huge amount of information that is then useful everywhere else. So I think that has to be a key factor in making decisions about where you place a limited amount of resource.
Sorry, can I just add something else?
Yes.
And I think it's particularly relevant when it comes to things like universal services, sports, leisure, culture. There's also a question about where can you make the greatest impact. And sometimes when you're focusing on the most vulnerable communities, the young people that in most need, the really real acute end, actually that's not the best place for us to focus our attention. You know, for example, I think working with young people, there's more of an impact if you're focusing on the young people who might just be about to tip into a difficult, challenging situation, but actually intervention, particularly in terms of sports and arts, I know more from my own background, can make a much, much bigger impact there in terms of where you're best placed to focus your resource. And that's in quite hard and fast terms in terms of the numbers and how much difference you can make in actually in a fairly quantifiable way.
This is an excellent conversation. Thank you all. And that whole subject of adolescent risk and when to intervene and where to prioritise is so crucial. So I want to wrap up by thanking all our excellent panellists, Chris, Paula, Adam, Lorna, Lola, Claire and Katie. Katie had to drop off the call due to tech issues a little while ago, but she sends her apologies, but it was good that we were able to hear from her. Thank you to Mark, for moderating, and to our interpreter as well for interpreting throughout. I hope you found it a thought-provoking session. I certainly could have listened to all of you for another hour. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you to the audience for your time as well and for your questions, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Sally.
Thanks, Sally.